two biggest economies are standing at the edge of the most perilous trade conflict since World War II. What are the risks of an all-out trade war? Is compromise possible on the trade and markets to avoid hurting both economies? And how can China and the U.S. manage their differences rather than allowing tensions to continue escalating? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Andy Mok, founder of Red Pagoda Resources, Professor Su Hao from China Foreign Affairs University, and Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. And that is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Li Qiuyuan. Before we start, let's take a look at this.
Washington announced an official statement on Thursday, stating that President Trump has instructed the U.S. Trade Representative to consider $100 billion worth of additional tariffs on Chinese products. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce was quick to respond.
我们不想打，但不怕打贸易战。
We don't want a trade war, but we are not afraid of it. Regarding the U.S. statement, we will watch and see. If the U.S. continues to ignore objections from China and the international community and insist upon unilateral decisions and protectionism, then China will fight on at all costs. China will conduct new corresponding measures to defend the national and people's interests.
将奉陪到底。
Though both the Commerce and Foreign Affairs ministries have reiterated their hope to avoid a trade war, both are adamant about their readiness to fight back if necessary, and at any cost. Tensions are high and have been escalating quickly over the past few days. The Trump administration's proposed tariffs on a list of 1,300 Chinese products worth around $50 billion on Tuesday includes transportation products, communication, satellites, industrial lasers and robots, commercial and household electronics, and other goods. In response, China retaliated with a list of its own, slapping $50 billion worth of reciprocal tariffs on 106 U.S. products. This includes agriculture products such as soybeans, as well as cars, aircraft, and chemical products. On top of that, China said it filed an official complaint to the WTO following the decision by the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum.
All right, let's take a look at the latest development on this looming trade war. Both sides have taken actions, threatening tariffs, posturing. Would you say the trade war has started, Andy?
Well, I think the opening shots definitely have been launched. But I think there's also, it's important to recognize here that there actually may be a silver lining in this cloud, and that this threat of a trade war, even if it ends up being an actual trade war, could be a clarifying and cathartic moment, in that I think the U.S. for very long has dominated the global economy and has bullied a lot of other countries. And I think China now has the confidence to say, you know, we can stand up to this, and I think even has the confidence to show a bit of wit in saying, I think the response was, it's only polite that we reciprocate.
Professor Su, do you agree the opening shots has been launched?
Well, I think that we should be careful to use the war of trade. You know, so far I would say that we should take the time to see. Even though the Trump administration already has declared that they were prepared for the war against China, you know, in the economic fields. But from China's side, I would say that we should be, be careful about that, and we do not want intention to have such kind of the military, economic and the trade conflict with the United States, because we have already interdependence with each other, economic, in particular the trade fields. So I think there's the friction or conflict, even the war, that is the bad issue for us. So that it means the lose-lose relation between us. So I will try to avoid such kind of issue.
It's a somewhat cautious view. What about you, Professor Ray?
I'm increasingly nervous because the resignation of Gary Cohn as the former Goldman Sachs head and the National Economic Council leader, who was in favor of engagement with China, in favor of trade and global free trade, and was a Democrat, his resignation because these tariffs leaves basically protectionists like Peter Navarro in charge, and Donald Trump is increasingly streamlining his foreign policy to those who agree with him, and he's a protectionist, and not those who are in favor of free trade. So I think this is the opening battle, and one that will not go well, I think, increasingly for the U.S., because I think China's already played a good opening hand.
I want to also get your thoughts on the latest response from U.S. officials, because when asked whether the U.S. tariffs announced on Tuesday may never go into effect or maybe a negotiating tactic, the president's top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, said it's possible. It's part of that process. He called the announcement by the two countries' mayor opening proposals. So he doesn't see it as a trade war. He doesn't see it that way. Do you think that this is somewhat, U.S. officials playing it down in hopes of talks?
I think the U.S. kind of recognized that China is not in a position to back down, and China's not as dependent on American imports as it used to be. And so I think they're already walking back this opening battle to suggest it may not be going as well as they had hoped.
Professor Su, how's China taking this response from the U.S. side?
Yeah, there's this English saying that use the war to stop the war. Okay, so now China already announced some retaliating the action against the American products. Okay, so we already add some kind of extra tariff of the 25% on American goods. So, but I don't think it's Chinese original intention. We have to do in response to Americans' behaviors against Chinese trade, so-called unfair trade. So from China's side, I think that we by this way to try to let Americans aware that the trade friction or even the trade war is really serious between us. So both sides should take care of that and maybe go back to step back and also go back to the tables for negotiation and also consultation.
Andy, help us pinpoint what does the United States want from China now? What's on that wish list?
Well, I think there's a couple things that I think the Trump administration has been very clear about. I mean, the first is reducing the trade deficit. The second is greater market access to China and some sort of remedy for the perceived IP theft. So I think those are the three things that are on the U.S. government's wish list.
And is China likely to make concessions?
I'm not so sure, because I think that, as James was saying, that the administration has walked back some of these threatened tariffs. I think the reason is that they were a little bit surprised by the speed at which China was able to respond. So I think that China's in a much stronger position today, not just in the size of its economy. So if we look now, China's economy is, what, about $24 trillion in purchasing power parity terms. So already the largest economy in the world versus $17 trillion in the U.S. We're talking single-digit percentages of GDP when we look at imports and exports. So I think there's not that much to lose on the Chinese side, and China has a much higher pain threshold in these matters, I think, than the United States does. So I think China may concede just in the interest of maintaining good bilateral relations, but I think certainly that the leverage that the U.S. believes it has might be a lot less.
You would agree with what's been said, Professor Su?
Yeah, I also want to say that the United States is a superpower, also economic super economy in the world. So it has quite a lot of leverage, excuse me, quite a lot of leverage against China. So some comments said that China will be loose. Even China will be defeated by the American trade war, right? So the reason why is Donald Trump has very much conservative, confidence to launch this kind of the trade friction against China. But I would say that we should take the long run to see or to analyze the kind of the trade relation between us. As Andy said, as China, as there's no potential economy in the world, maybe it could be the first, in the coming year, or Chinese market is quite huge, or the potentials, the consumers in China is quite a lot, So I would say that Chinese economy could be an opportunity for the United States. So if that's just a short C to, just take such kind of trade problem with China, maybe they will lose the market in the future. So I would say that for the American administration, they should be careful about such kind of the trade, war against China.
I want to also get your thoughts, Professor Ray, on China's strategy now, because China is now threatening to hurt U.S. economy where, supporters vote for Trump. China has singled out certain sectors, soybean, pork, beef, playing cars. How bad it is if it goes into effect for Trump administration?
Well, I think
how do you look at this
that
strategy?
really captures the dilemma. I think this was basically a 1 month ago decision of negotiating tactics by the Trump administration. And this was a 2-year plan for China on how to react to the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And so hitting the agricultural states like Iowa, which will be key to his reelection, automobiles with Michigan as a key state, the industrial Midwest, these are states that they targeted very correctly. And so I think that first battle is essentially won by China and has forced the U.S. really to walk back this position.
And to jump in very briefly there with the proposed tariffs against airplanes, I think China's also demonstrated sophistication in that it's cut off just right below the largest Boeing airplanes to show that we could go further if we need to. So again, I think this idea of a very calibrated response.
What other options do China have if there is a full-blown trade war? What's China's checkmate move, Professor Su?
Yes, well, China and the U.S. Interdependent quite a lot in the trade relations. Of course, we're also the biggest buyer to Americans' agricultural products, right? You know, in particular, the soybeans or some others crops from the Midwest state in the United States. Actually, this kind of state are the swing state. Okay, so in the past years, the presidential election, so these swing states change their position and then make the Donald Trump to win. So I would say that if they cannot swing states lost quite a lot by such kind of the trade friction with China, maybe they could change their position in the coming, you know, there will be midterm election this year, right? And also the next term for Donald Trump's election. So maybe that will make the problem to this administration.
Yeah. Let's get on to the bottom of it. Trump said the unfair Chinese trade practices are responsible for a U.S. trade deficit with China, which has reached a record $375 billion on his watch, but others doesn't agree. They say deficit is due to not enough saving versus investment in the United States. How do you view, you know, this trade imbalance?
Well, I think both are correct. I mean, there are structural reasons for the trade deficit, and it's a deficit that the U.S. has not just with China, but many other countries, South Korea, Japan, even Germany. So I think that is correct. But I think that being said, it also needs to be recognized that a lot of this is driven by the profit incentive by U.S. multinationals like the Walmarts, like the Apples, that are looking for cheaper labor to increase their profit margins. So there isn't a single villain or culprit here. I think it's a complex phenomenon, and that there are multiple reasons for it. But I think Trump, in targeting or emphasizing the Chinese actions, or I guess the advantages that China brings in exacerbating the trade deficit, plays exactly into his political logic of, you know, how did he get elected? What does he need to do to get reelected? So I think it's not surprising at all.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that the trade structure is quite complicated between China and the U.S. Actually, in China or in East Asia, so-called the products made in China actually is not really made in China. We already have the trade, you know, the encircled within the East Asia. Actually, we say that this is the chain of production. So the products made in China, actually, this is made in East Asia because the parts of products, for example, some components produced in Japan, in South Korea, or in countries in Southeast Asia. So China imported all these parts into side of China. We assembled all the components together into one product and labeled made in China and sold out to United States. So this is, you know, complicated, you know, economic structure inside of East Asia. So just to say that there's simple defines the bilateral relation between China and U.S. regarding deficit, it's not fair. So I would say that on the American side, we should take care about this.
How would you respond to that, Professor Ray? Is it fair, Trump's statement?
Well, I think the anti-China feeling in the U.S. and particularly among the Trump constituency is in relation to this trade deficit, but somewhat as Andy said, I mean, these are mostly American brands that are importing into the U.S. If we were actually importing Chinese brands like Huawei, which I think almost more dramatically has basically been cut out of the U.S. market in this last month as well, and the restrictions in the U.S. on Chinese foreign investment, I think reflect a greater element of this rivalry that is even perhaps more important than the trade dispute.
All right. Let's take a short break. We'll continue our discussion after this. Don't go away. Back to dialogue. So comprehensive economic dialogue was part of 4 dialogue announced last year after the Mar-a-Lago meeting. Is it safe to say that at this stage that has collapsed, Andy?
Well, I think it's certainly in hiatus. You know, it's been shelved, and we'll see what happens from here.
Is it still time for the 2 countries to resolve the disputes through negotiations, Professor Su?
Well, actually, last year, there's very good progress between China and U.S. regarding our bilateral relations. So this 4 platform, strategic platform for our dialogue will solidate and you know, intensifies our relation with each other. So that makes stabilize our bilateral relation and also make a very good image to outside of the world that these two giants have the stable relation with each other. That would be, creates a very good phenomenon for all our, international society. So I have to say that we still keep this kind of momentum for our communication, dialogue with each other. So I hope that in the coming times, we should have the time to, resume our dialogue.
What's U.S. Perspective on this? What will need to happen?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic because the U.S. Ambassador, Terry Branstad, from my home state of Iowa, is a soybean state. He has a very good personal relationship with President Xi, and both in Mar-a-Lago and Beijing, President Xi and President Trump, I think, do have a good personal rapport. And so I think the more opportunities to have phone calls and face-to-face meetings, I think Trump, like Reagan before him, who I think he imagines himself to be, sees the importance of the personal. And so I think when there's too much distance, this can erupt. But I'm still optimistic when there's another gathering, this will be still a part of the
Well, the WTO is listening to both sides on this case at the moment. What issues are they considering, do you think? What will be the outcome of, any arbitration?
Well, I think it's an existential challenge for the WTO because is it able to remain relevant? Because the Trump administration, I think, has publicly disparaged, and I think through its actions as well, shown that it is maybe looking for more bilateral type relationships. And China has been a big supporter and I think, since day one, very involved in WTO. But with this particular trade dispute, I think both sides are not coming to it completely with clean hands. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Will both sides accept any decision from the WTO?
Well, it is pity for me to see the Americans' behavior at the moment. Well, in the past, WTO is made by the United States, of course, as the major, the real player within this process of the economic, international economy structure. So, but unfortunately, at the moment, United States' behavior is already violated its original WTO's rule as a ruling maker in the past, right? So I have to say that from China's side, we do hope to go to the arbitrations in a WTO, a dispute settlement procedure. And if the procedure will be launched, I would say that China will have much more, advantages to, to win in this kind of disputes, I would say.
Professor Ray, will WTO play any role in this?
Well, I agree with what's been said. I think the Trump administration's hostility to global free trade has sort of jeopardized its partnerships, and the institution making of the WTO is not going to reward American power because it's been a military superpower. The U.S. is in violation of the institution that it led and that encouraged China to join. So I think it's not fruitful.
Now, IP protection has been a particular point of contention as China works to remake its economy. Andy mentioned this too. What can be done on China's part on this, Professor?
Well, I would say that so far China has taken caution to launch such a kind of trade problem, right? So we still hold ourselves to constrain ourselves, even though we already launched our countermeasure against Americans' trade issues. But I would say that, like the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, said that we try to, not our intention to launch the war, right? And we try to, persuade or to let the United States aware that such kind of the trade friction between us will be make us both sides to lose, and there will be damages our economies, not only bilateral economy but also the world economy. So I would say that China's side already take their so-called responsible stakeholders role to manage this kind of trade issue. The United States also should take some kind of the way to manage the bilateral relation with China. So I have to say that maybe in the coming time, have the common ground to find the solution for this kind of issues.
Can a common ground found in this IP protection?
Well, yeah, I think China's been moving the last 15 years to be in compliance with intellectual property rights and made domestic reforms. I think there's still a ways to go, as with many countries, and I think that's been on the dialogue at the WTO rounds of discussion, and that's why it's important for the U.S. to be leading in the WTO and in global free trade, so that it encourages countries to continue to move in the right direction.
On a related issue, the New York Times ran an article which stated that tariffs was not the fundamental problem in U.S.-China trade, but instead U.S. is beginning to push back hard on China's bid for surge in technological innovation. It wants to maintain its technological supremacy, and that's why it's happening at any cost. What do you think of that theory? Do you agree?
I think that's quite accurate. I mean, one way to look at this is that the core issue here between the U.S. and China is that the U.S. has been like the only child, the somewhat spoiled child who's been used to getting its way, and now gets to school and realizes there are other people that are just as good, just as smart, and now it's a psychological trauma to say, hey, I have to now get along with other people, and I'm not the only person that gets to say how things are. So I think that whether it's IP, whether it's trade, whether it's technological security, that at the core, when we hear these terms, American leadership, that I think really is what it's about. Can't accept another country, China, as a peer, and even as a superior in some ways. We look at the size of the economy. It's easy to see the trajectory in technologies like artificial intelligence and 5G, where I think China has plausibly, very plausible claim to being the world leader.
Your thoughts on this?
Well, the U.S. advantage has been technology in Silicon Valley, and I do think in e-commerce, in green energy, and a host of other areas, China's moving forward. And so I think the U.S. does have that vulnerability that is being manifest here in this discussion.
And do you think that's part of the reason why U.S. launched a trade war?
Well, of course, at the moment, there's America's reasons to launch the war against China in trade, right? But I would say that regarding the accuse taken by Donald Trump, say that China has already have some big potential challenges to America's economy, or even America's high-tech, industry, right? But I would say that China and the United States, as a big giant economy in the world, we have the reciprocal and the complementary relation with each other. For example, like China, we already have the so-called new four innovations, right, which is not very good in the United States, like the e-pay or like the electronic pay, right? So I think that China will be also make a contribution to the American side regarding the economic escalation. Of course, we get quite a lot of high-tech products from the United States if they have lifted their restriction on China. So we have the reciprocal interaction with each other and also mutual benefits with each other. That'd be a good choice for us.
Now, if you look at the bigger picture, a lot of people, analysts, China watchers, believe the theme of competition will dominate U.S.-China relationship in the coming years with limited cooperation. Would you agree with that saying?
I don't think so. I mean, clearly there is a competitive aspect to this relationship, but there is, and I believe will continue to be, very promising and vital areas for cooperation, whether that's on climate change, whether that's joint research into other areas, trade, of course, trade and services, education, tourism. So I think that any complex relationship, whether that's a marriage, whether that's a strategic alliance between two companies or relationships between two countries, are complex, and there are areas of conflict and there are areas of cooperation.
You're very hopeful. What about you, Professor Ray?
Well, I think the bipartisan consensus in the United States in favor of engagement with China has fractured with the Cold War dissipating. I think this particular administration threatens to unravel that because it's become so isolated from the mainstream foreign policy positions in Washington. And so I'm still confident that looking forward a few years, we'll return back to some form of engagement, but I think strategic competition will continue to grow, and now even economic competition.
Yeah, another thing we're seeing is, Trump is being surrounded with neoconservative politicians with very hawkish view, people like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo. What should China do when considering dealing with pressures brought by views from advisors like these?
Yeah, it is real situations. I worry about that in the United States regarding the domestic politics. We know that Donald Trump, since he got in power, he already shipped his key leaders inside of his administration, right? So like the State Department, like the security advisor, like some other senior officer, but now just narrowed what we focus on the newcomer. So I worry about that. But I would say that regarding the responsible government in the United States, I would say that they could learn something, because Donald Trump is a new politician, right? So he just much more focused on his own way or his own mindset to manage his political affairs. But I think that he's not very mature to manage such kind of issues. So if this kind of things were damaged by both sides, U.S. and China, maybe Donald Trump should learn something from that. And then maybe he could make some kind of rational choice to improve his policy.
Yeah. How do you see the willingness and capacity for crisis management on both sides for avoiding crisis?
Well, I think when we look at this new group of advisors that Trump has, very hawkish, but very clear about what they're looking to accomplish. I think what the key here is that they respect strength and they respect power. So in this way, I think China has played it right in saying, let's not overreact. We will reciprocate, measure for measure. But, and I think that is probably the best policy option for working with the Trump administration, as we see that they've walked back some of these claims. I think probably in response to seeing the strength and the preparation that China has for dealing with these trade issues.
Yeah, we're running out of time. Final remarks from you, Professor Ray. How do you see things going from here? Further escalation or
well, I think because of the greater wisdom in Beijing, I think there's wiggle room of China giving some face-saving measure to Trump administration of some mild measures, or to retaliate if the U.S. wants to continue to go down this path. So I think at least it is an economic dispute. It's a rational dispute, and so we should have rational minds to resolve.
All right, thank you very much. Andy and Professor Su, Professor Ray, thank you for joining us and for your analysis as well. And that does it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for watching.